At 69 years old, Helen Harrison made a decision that everyone in her life would call madness. She sat in a courtroom smaller than she had imagined on a wooden chair that creaked every time she shifted her weight, and she prepared to give away everything she had spent 4 decades building. Her hands rested in her lap, folded neatly, trembling just enough that she pressed her thumbs together to keep them still. Across the aisle, separated by a distance that felt far greater than 12 feet of municipal carpet, her husband of 42 years sat beside his attorney, a sharp-dressed man in his early 30s who kept glancing at his phone between whispered bursts of strategy. Walter Harrison had not looked at her once since they entered. Not when the bailiff called the session to order. Not when the judge reviewed the filings. Not when their marriage was reduced to line items on a legal pad. 42 years of building a life of shared meals and shared silence and shared grief over parents buried and milestones celebrated and a son raised in a house they purchased when that son was still small enough to carry on one hip. And Walter could not bring himself to meet her eyes. He sat with his jaw set and his shoulders squared, performing the posture of a man who had made a difficult but necessary decision. And Helen watched him and thought about how strange it was that someone could become a stranger while still wearing the watch you gave them for their 30th anniversary. The proceedings had stretched across 3 months. 3 months of lawyers exchanging documents with the solemnity of wartime generals. 3 months of depositions where Helen was asked to account for decades as though her life were a ledger. 3 months of financial disclosures that reduced a marriage to its material remains, the house, the accounts, the investments, the objects. And running beneath all of it like a current, the argument over who deserved what from a union that Walter had decided quite suddenly and without warning was finished. He had filed on her 69th birthday. She had woken that morning in their bedroom on the second floor of the mansion, the one with the bay window overlooking the manicured lawn, and she had lain still for a moment listening to the house. It was always quiet, their home. Impressive in its silence, the way cathedrals are impressive, all that space designed to make you feel small. She had come downstairs expecting something modest, maybe a card on the counter, or the smell of coffee he had bothered to brew, and instead she found a manila envelope beside the coffee maker, her name typed on a label, and inside it divorce papers and a handwritten note on his personal stationery. 5 words that ended 42 years. I need to be free to find myself before it's too late. Free. As if their entire life together had been a prison. As if she had been the warden rather than the woman who ironed his shirts at 5 in the morning and sat alone at dinner parties waiting for him to finish one more call. The mansion was worth approximately $3.2 million. It sat on 2 acres in a neighborhood where the lawns were maintained by crews that arrived in white trucks, and where the neighbors communicated through holiday cards and the occasional wave from the end of their respective driveways. Walter wanted it, all of it. His attorney was arguing that since Walter had been the primary earner throughout their marriage, a successful investment banker who had built a portfolio and a reputation and a life that funded every luxury they enjoyed, he deserved the lion's share of their assets. The word deserved appeared frequently in the filings. Helen's attorney Diane had pointed this out with a raised eyebrow and a voice that carried the exhaustion of someone who had seen this particular argument destroy better people than Walter Harrison. Diane was fighting. She was good at it, experienced and sharp, and unwilling to let Helen be steamrolled by a man who confused earning money with earning a marriage. But Helen could see in Diane's eyes the particular fatigue that comes from fighting an uphill battle in a system that still, despite everything, treated women who stayed home as women who chose not to work, as though raising a child and managing a household and maintaining a life was leisure rather than labor. The judge looked tired. Everyone looked tired. Helen understood the feeling because she was exhausted too, but her exhaustion ran deeper than legal briefs and court dates. She was tired of the anger, tired of the accusations, tired of the way Walter's attorney kept implying with the smooth condescension of someone billing $400 an hour that Helen had been a passenger in her own life. But she was most tired of something else entirely. She was tired of thinking about Nathan. Their son was 38. He lived in London with his wife Claire and their two children, Emma and Jack. He worked for a consulting firm that had transferred him overseas 3 years ago, and he called every Sunday at 9 in the morning, adjusting for the time difference, the way he adjusted for everything in his parents' lives. Carefully, deliberately, always trying to hold things together from 5,000 miles away. Since the divorce filing, those Sunday calls had become daily calls, sometimes twice daily. Nathan's voice carrying a strain that Helen recognized because she had heard it in her own voice for years. The strain of someone trying to fix something that could not be fixed by effort alone. He begged them to work it out. He suggested counseling mediation, a trial separation that might lead to reconciliation. He asked them to remember what they had once meant to each other, and each time he asked, Helen could hear the little boy in the man, the child who had believed his parents were permanent, the way mountains are permanent. And every one of those calls broke something inside her that she was not sure could be reassembled. Because Nathan was not asking them to save their marriage. He was asking them to save the story he had built his life upon, the story that said his family was whole, and Helen could not give him that story anymore, but she could. She realized give him something else. She could give him the mercy of a clean ending. She could spare him the spectacle of two people who once loved each other, tearing at the carcass of that love in a public courtroom for the next 12 months. During the recess, Diane pulled her into a hallway that smelled of floor wax and old coffee. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, giving everything a slightly green cast. And Diane's voice was low and urgent. I think we can fight this, Helen. We can argue for equal distribution. You gave up your career to support his. You were a teacher. You had credentials, a trajectory, a life that you put on hold so he could build his. You raised Nathan. You managed that household for decades. You deserve half of everything. Helen looked through the courthouse window at the parking lot, where Walter stood smoking a cigarette. He was not supposed to be smoking, his phone pressed to his ear. His back turned to the building where his marriage was being disassembled. She watched him laugh at something the person on the other end said, and she thought about a receipt she had found 3 months before the filing, tucked into the pocket of his charcoal suit when she was sorting laundry. A dinner receipt from a restaurant downtown, the kind with white tablecloths and a wine list thicker than a novel. 2 guests, a Tuesday evening. He had told her he was working late. She had believed him because she had spent 42 years believing him. Because believing him was easier than examining what not believing him would mean. She never confronted him about the receipt. She simply folded it and placed it in the back of her jewelry box behind the pearls he had given her for their 20th anniversary. And she carried the knowledge the way she carried most painful things. Silently, privately folded into a compartment of herself that she did not open in company. She did not need proof of a girlfriend. She had something more reliable than proof. She had 42 years of knowing Walter Harrison, and she knew what it looked like when he was done. What will it cost? Helen asked quietly. The fight. What will it cost Nathan to watch his parents destroy each other in court for the next year? Diane was quiet for a long moment. Through the window, Walter dropped his cigarette and ground it under his heel. It will cost him, Helen. It will cost everyone. Helen made her decision in that hallway with the buzzing lights and the wax smell floor. And she made it not because she believed she did not deserve better, and not because she thought Walter was right, but because she had one thing left that mattered more to her than marble floors and a prestigious address. She had her dignity, and she had her son. When they returned to the courtroom, Helen did something that made Diane reach for her arm as though trying to physically restrain a woman from walking off a cliff. Helen asked to speak. The judge, a woman in her late 50s with reading glasses perched on her nose and the expression of someone who had witnessed the full range of human pettiness, granted permission. Your Honor, I would like to renounce my claim to the marital home and accept a settlement of $100,000. I believe this will allow us to conclude these proceedings quickly and with minimal continued conflict. The courtroom went silent with the particular quality of silence that follows a detonation that half second before anyone understands what has happened. Walter's attorney looked up from his phone for the first time in 20 minutes. Diane grabbed Helen's arm, her fingers pressing through the fabric of Helen's sleeve. "Helen, you can't do this." "I can." Helen's voice barely above a whisper, steady as a hand on a rudder. "And I am." The judge removed her glasses and studied Helen with an expression that held both pity and something that might have been respect, the two emotions so close together they were nearly indistinguishable. "Mrs. Harrison, I want to make sure you understand what you are agreeing to. You are renouncing rights to a property valued at over $3 million in exchange for $100,000. This is legally binding once you sign." "I understand, Your Honor." Helen's back was straight. Her hands had stopped trembling. "I am 69 years old. I do not have time left to spend years fighting over things. I would rather spend whatever time I have left building something new." She signed the papers. Her hand shook, but it did not hesitate. And there is a difference between shaking and hesitating that anyone who has ever done something terrifying understands. A hand can shake with the body's honest response to fear while still moving forward. A hand that hesitates is a hand that is not sure. Helen was sure. Walter stood as the proceedings concluded. For the first time that day, he looked at her, and his expression was complicated in ways Helen did not have the energy to decode. There was triumph in it, certainly. He had gotten what he wanted. But beneath the triumph, there was something else, something that flickered across his features the way a shadow crosses a wall, too quick to name, but unmistakable to anyone watching. "You'll regret this." His voice was cold, but his hands were in his pockets, and Helen noticed he was pressing his fists against his thighs the way he always did when he was unsure of something. "When you realize you have nowhere to go, no one to take care of you, you'll regret giving up everything." Helen met his eyes calmly. She looked at this man she had married when she was 27, and he was 29, this man she had loved with the desperate totality of youth, and then with the quieter persistence of middle age, and then with the weary loyalty of long habit. And she saw clearly, perhaps for the first time, that he did not understand what he was looking at. He saw a woman who had lost. He could not see that she had chosen. "I'm not giving up everything, Walter. I'm giving up nothing that matters. There is a difference." She picked up her purse and walked out of that courthouse into the afternoon sunshine of a Tuesday in July. And she did not look back, because looking back was something she had decided in that hallway with the buzzing lights she would no longer do. In her purse was a key. It was old brass, worn smooth by decades of sitting on a keychain, alongside keys to cars she no longer owned and doors she no longer opened. She had been carrying it for 3 months, since the morning she found the divorce papers, since the moment she understood that her marriage was over and that she would need somewhere to go. The key opened a door to a house she had not visited in over 30 years. The house on Maple Street, the house where Nathan was born. It was a small 3-bedroom in a middle-class suburb 40 minutes outside the city, in a neighborhood where people knew each other's names and mowed their own lawns and left their garage doors open on summer evenings, because they were not afraid of what might come in. Helen and Walter had lived there for the first 7 years of their marriage, before his career took off, and suddenly they could afford a house that announced their success to anyone driving past. They had kept the Maple Street house, meaning to sell it, discussing it occasionally the way you discuss a chore you intend to get around to but never quite do. The house sat in an irrevocable trust that Helen's father had established before her marriage, a trust that bore only her name. Walter knew the house existed. He had always called it that dump, the way he called anything that did not reflect his current standard of living, with a dismissiveness that was so automatic it had become invisible. His attorney had not included it in the asset disclosures because Walter had told him it was worthless, a teardown in a neighborhood that was not going anywhere. And the attorney had taken his client at his word because the attorney was billing $400 an hour and was not inclined to investigate a property his client considered beneath notice, which meant it was still Helen's. Entirely legally, unquestionably hers. The drive to Maple Street took 45 minutes through traffic that moved in the stop and start rhythm of a heartbeat. And Helen spent the drive remembering. She remembered bringing Nathan home from the hospital, Walter driving 15 miles under the speed limit because he was terrified of the infant in the car seat, both of them laughing with the giddy terror of new parents. She remembered the kitchen where she learned to make pot roast from Walter's mother, who had visited that first Thanksgiving, and stood beside Helen at the stove, and told her in a voice rough with cigarettes and affection that the secret to a good marriage was the same as the secret to a good roast, low heat and patience. She remembered the backyard where Nathan took his first steps, lurching across the grass toward a yellow ball, falling and getting up and falling again, with the determination of someone who did not know yet that falling was supposed to discourage you. These memories lived in a place Walter could not access, because Walter had not been paying attention when they were made. He had been at work. He had been building the career that would eventually buy them the mansion that would eventually become the setting for his note on the kitchen counter. The memories belonged to Helen and Nathan, and the small house where they had happened. And Walter's indifference to that house was, Helen realized, the most honest thing about him. He did not value what he had not been present for. The neighborhood had not changed much. Small houses, most well maintained, with the comfortable plainness of homes that were lived in rather than displayed. Chain-link fences instead of stone walls. Cars in driveways instead of three-car garages. Children's bicycles lying in yards with the careless trust of a place where things left out were generally left alone. She pulled up in front of number 47. The house was one story, roughly 1,200 square feet, with white siding that had gone gray with decades of weather, and a front porch that sagged slightly on one side, like a face settling into an expression of weary welcome. The yard was overgrown. The mailbox tilted at an angle that suggested it had been struck by something and never straightened, and several windows had shutters missing slats. It looked abandoned because it was. Helen carried her suitcase up the porch steps, testing each one with her weight before committing to it. The key was old and warm from being in her purse all day. She slid it into the lock. It stuck, the mechanism gritty with disuse, and she had to work it back and forth, jiggling and twisting, until something inside gave way with a sound like a sigh, and the door swung open. The smell hit her first. Stale air layered with dust and the faint sweetness of mildew. The smell of a place that had been sealed and forgotten, breathing its own exhale for 3 decades. But as her eyes adjusted to the dim interior, she saw past the decay. The ceilings were high for a house this size, a feature she had forgotten, and they gave the rooms a sense of openness that belied the square footage. Hardwood floors stretched beneath a layer of grime and scattered debris leaves that had blown in through cracks, a bird's nest that had fallen from somewhere above the desiccated husk of something small that had found its way in and not found its way out. The windows were filthy but intact, and through them shafts of afternoon light fell in long angles that illuminated the dust motes swirling in the air. She had disturbed, golden and slow, like something from a painting of a place that had been holy once and might be again. She walked through the house slowly, her suitcase left by the door, her footsteps leaving prints in the dust like tracks across fresh snow. The kitchen was small counters, yellowed cabinets hanging slightly open as though they had been caught mid-conversation. She touched the counter where she had rolled out dough for Nathan's birthday cakes, pressing her palm flat against the surface, and she could feel beneath the grime the slight indentation where a rolling pin had been used so many times it had worn a groove into the laminate. The bathroom still had the same pale blue tiles. She remembered, cracked now in places, but still holding their color, still marking the spot where she had knelt beside the tub and bathed a baby who screamed at the temperature of the water, no matter how carefully she tested it. Nathan's room stopped her. She stood in the doorway and looked at the walls, bare now except for the faded rectangles where posters had hung, ghostly outlines of a childhood preserved in the absence of what had covered them. The closet door still stuck the same way it always had, requiring a slight lift and pull that her body remembered before her mind did muscle memory outlasting conscious thought. And there on the doorframe were the marks. Growth chart lines in pencil, each one labeled in Helen's handwriting. 6 months, 1 year, 18 months, 2 years. The lines climbed the frame in increments that told the story of a boy becoming taller. Each mark a moment when Helen had stood Nathan against the wood and held a book flat on his head and drawn a careful line and written the date beside it. The last mark read 6.5 years. After that, they had moved to the mansion. After that, measuring had seemed less important, or perhaps there had simply been no doorframe in that enormous house that felt personal enough to mark. She traced the lines with her finger, pressing gently against each penciled note. She could feel the years in the wood, the way the grain had absorbed the graphite, the way time had neither erased nor preserved these marks, but had simply held them, waiting for someone to come back and read them. The master bedroom destroyed her composure entirely. She walked in and stood in the center of the empty room and looked at the walls and the floor and the window that faced the backyard, where Nathan had taken his first steps, and she sat down on the dusty floor because her legs would not hold her any longer. This was the room where she and Walter had been happy, where they had lain awake planning a future that neither of them could see clearly, but both of them believed in. They had been poor then, surviving on his entry-level salary and her teacher's income clipping coupons, and celebrating when they could afford a night out. And they had been happy in the way that people are happy when they do not yet know what they will become. When had it changed? She could not identify the moment. It had been gradual, like erosion, like the way a river carves a canyon not through violence, but through the steady, patient application of water to stone over years and years, until one day you look up and realize the landscape has been transformed, and you cannot remember what it looked like before. That night, Helen slept in a sleeping bag on the floor of Nathan's old room, surrounded by the geometry of his childhood. No electricity, no running water, no comfort beyond the sleeping bag she had thought to buy at a sporting goods store, on the way stopping in the parking lot, and sitting in her car for 10 minutes before going in, because the weight of what she was doing had landed on her. Suddenly and completely, the way grief does, arriving, not when the loss occurs, but later at some ordinary moment in a parking lot, when you are thinking about sleeping bags. She should have been terrified. She was 69 years old, alone in an abandoned house with no utilities and no plan beyond surviving the night. And by every practical measure, Walter was right. She had nowhere to go and no one to take care of her. But lying on that floor, listening to the sounds of the house settling around her, the creaks and ticks of old wood adjusting to the presence of a person after so long without one, she felt something she had not felt in years. She felt alive, not comfortable, not safe, not secure. Alive the way you feel alive when you are doing something that matters, something that demands your full attention, something that is yours in a way that nothing in the mansion had ever been hers. She woke to sunlight coming through the window of Nathan's room, falling across the growth chart marks on the doorframe, illuminating them like scripture. Her body protested the hard floor with a chorus of complaints from her back, her hips, her knees, each joint registering its objection to the night's accommodations. She rose slowly, bracing herself against the wall, and she began to explore with the systematic attention of someone taking inventory of what remained. In the hall closet behind a vacuum cleaner that had not worked since the first Bush administration, she found a box. Inside it, Nathan's first pair of baby shoes, leather-soled and impossibly small. A photo album from his first year. The photograph slightly yellowed, showing a baby with enormous eyes and a woman in her late 20s who looked tired and terrified and incandescently happy. Some of Helen's old teaching certificates, her name in careful calligraphy on heavy paper. And at the bottom, a Valentine's card from 1985, the paper soft with age. Walter's handwriting inside it still legible, the ink only slightly faded. To my beautiful wife, every day with you is a gift. She sat on the hallway floor with these artifacts arranged around her like relics in a personal museum. and she held the Valentine's card and the baby shoes simultaneously, one in each hand. And she thought about being 27 years old in this house, scared of failing as a mother, and so deeply in love with her husband that his coming home at the end of each day felt like a small daily miracle. She thought about the woman in the photographs, the one with the tired eyes and the radiant smile, and she tried to trace the line between that woman and the one sitting on this dusty floor at 69, and the line was not straight. It curved and doubled back and disappeared in places the way all lives do when you try to draw them from memory. The doorbell startled her. She had not heard a doorbell in this house in 3 decades, and the sound was so unexpected that she nearly dropped the Valentine's card. She placed everything carefully back in the box and went to the door aware that she was wearing yesterday's clothes, and that her hair was uncombed, and that she probably looked exactly like what she was, a woman who had slept on the floor of an abandoned house and was not entirely sure what came next. A woman in her 60s stood on the porch holding a casserole dish. She had silver hair cut short and practical reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, and the kind face of someone who had learned through long experience that the best way to introduce yourself to a person in crisis was to bring food and ask few questions. "Hi, I'm Dorothy Miller from next door number 49. I saw someone moving in yesterday and thought I'd bring a welcome dish." Helen stared at the casserole. When was the last time a neighbor had brought her food in 35 years at the mansion? Not once. Neighbors in that world did not bring casseroles. They sent invitations on cardstock and expected you to reciprocate within a socially acceptable time frame. "Thank you, that's very kind. Are you renting or buying?" "I own it, actually. I lived here years ago, a long time ago, and I'm starting over." Dorothy's expression shifted then, and Helen braced for pity for the head tilt and the sympathetic murmur that she had come to recognize as the way people responded to someone else's misfortune when they were grateful it was not their own. But Dorothy did not offer pity. Her expression held recognition, the look of a woman who had seen enough of life to understand what starting over meant at 69 and to respect it without needing the details. "Welcome home. If you need anything at all, I am at 49. After Dorothy left, Helen sat at the kitchen counter with the casserole dish still warm in her hands, and the Valentine's card from 1985, and the baby shoes from 1988. And she understood something that arrived not as a thought, but as a feeling. A shift in the way the air sat in her lungs, a change in the weight of the room. She had spent 30 years accumulating things, crystal and silver and art that required insurance, and furniture that required professionals to move, and a house that required a staff to maintain. She had accumulated until the accumulation itself became a kind of gravity holding her in place, making movement impossible. And somewhere in all that gathering of objects, she had lost what those objects were supposed to represent: connection, warmth, the feeling of being known. This house had her son's first steps marked on a doorframe. It had memories soaked into the walls the way water soaks into wood, invisible but structural part of what held the building up. And it had a neighbor who brought casserole without being asked, without expecting anything in return, without first checking whether the recipient was worth the effort. Helen ate straight from the dish standing at the counter, using a fork she found in a drawer that required effort to open. The casserole was chicken and rice, simple and good seasoned, with something she could not identify, but that tasted like someone had cared about the person who would eat it. It was the best meal she had eaten in months, not because of the ingredients, but because of the intention. And she stood in her dirty kitchen in her wrinkled clothes and ate until the dish was half empty, and her eyes were wet, and she was not sure whether she was crying from grief or gratitude, or simply from the overwhelming experience of being treated kindly by a stranger, at a moment when kindness was the one thing she had not expected to find. She spent the next day making the house livable. She drove to a hardware store and bought cleaning supplies, light bulbs, a few basic necessities. She scrubbed floors on her hands and knees until the hardwood emerged from beneath the grime, the grain still beautiful, the wood still sound. She washed windows until the light came through clean and strong. She swept out years of accumulated debris, filling trash bags that she stacked on the porch. She made the bathroom functional, the pipes groaning and spitting rust-colored water, before finally running clear. By nightfall, the house felt less like a ruin and more like a possibility. She had brought it back not to what it had been, but to something adjacent to habitable, a place that was willing to be lived in again if someone was willing to do the work. She lay on the floor of her bedroom that second night, and she thought about Dorothy's words, about community, about not doing this alone. She thought about the mansion neighborhood, where everyone was too busy maintaining appearances to actually appear, where asking for help was treated as a confession of inadequacy. Maybe this could be different. Maybe small houses required something that large houses did not: the willingness to be seen, the willingness to let someone bring you chicken casserole and not pretend you did not need it. And she realized, lying on the floor of the house where she had once been happiest, that despite everything she had lost: the marriage, the money, the security, the future she had assumed was guaranteed. She felt something she had not felt in years. She felt hopeful, not confident, not certain. Hopeful, which is a smaller and more honest thing. The acknowledgement that you do not know what comes next, but you believe it might be worth finding out. 3 days later, Helen was on her porch drinking coffee from a mug she had bought at the hardware store, sitting in a lawn chair Dorothy had lent her, when a black Mercedes pulled up to the curb. She knew the car before she knew the driver. She had spent 35 years being a passenger in cars like that: one leather interior, and climate control, and a GPS system that spoke in a calm female voice, as though even the technology in Walter's life was expected to be composed and accommodating. Walter got out. He was wearing weekend clothes, khakis, and a polo shirt. And he looked around Maple Street the way a tourist looks around a neighborhood they have been warned about, scanning for evidence that confirms what they already believe. "This is where you ended up." He did not say hello. "This is where I chose to be." "Helen, this is ridiculous. You are 69 years old. You cannot live like this." "I am living just fine. I talked to my lawyer. If you come back, we could revisit the settlement." "I am not coming back, Walter." His expression hardened, the muscles around his jaw tightening the way they always did when he encountered resistance he had not anticipated. Walter was a man who planned conversations the way he planned investments, calculating outcomes, and Helen's refusal to follow the script he had prepared was registering as a fluctuation he had not modeled for. When you run out of money, what then? You think you can survive on Social Security. Helen set down her coffee carefully on the porch railing. "I survived raising our son while you worked 100-hour weeks and missed his first steps and his first words and his first day of school. I survived managing a household on your starting salary when we had nothing. I survived your midlife crisis at 50 and your divorce papers on my birthday and your girlfriend, who is probably younger than our son. I think I can survive this." "There is no girlfriend." But his eyes shifted the way they always did when he was lying, a small lateral movement that Helen had catalogued decades ago and never mentioned. His phone rang. He pulled it from his pocket and glanced at the screen, and his face did something complicated, a flinch disguised as indifference. He did not answer it. But before he turned to leave, something happened that Helen did not expect. Walter walked toward his car, then stopped. He turned back toward the house, and his gaze went to the window of Nathan's old bedroom. He stepped closer almost involuntarily, and his hand rose and touched the windowsill, his fingers resting on the peeling paint for a moment. And Helen saw on his face an expression she had not seen in years. It was not regret exactly. It was more like bewilderment, the look of a man who has arrived at a place he remembers but cannot reconcile with the person he has become, as though the house were asking him a question he did not know how to answer. He held his hand there for 2, maybe 3 seconds. Then he pulled it away, shoved both hands into his pockets, and walked to his car without another word. Helen sat on her porch and watched the Mercedes disappear around the corner, and she did not know what to do with what she had seen. She filed it away in the same compartment where she kept the restaurant receipt, the space inside her where she stored things she could not yet process. She would take it out later when she was ready. For now, she had more immediate concerns. The settlement money would not last forever. $100,000 sounded like a number until you started subtracting from it. That evening, she sat at the kitchen counter with a notebook and a pencil, and she did what she had done for decades, the thing Walter never knew she did because he had never asked. She made a budget. 100,000 in savings, Social Security of approximately 1,400 a month. Medicare would cover the essentials, though the supplemental plan she needed would cost another 140 each month, a number she circled twice. The house carried no mortgage. Utilities once connected would be modest. The urgent repairs, the porch, the plumbing, the electrical panel that Eddie would later say needed updating, would cost between 15 and 20,000. That would leave roughly 80,000 as a cushion, enough to feel stable, but thin enough to feel the edge. She would need to find a way to supplement her income, not immediately but soon. She closed the notebook and sat in the quiet kitchen, and she felt alongside the worry a sensation she could not immediately name. It took her a moment to identify it. It was ownership. For the first time in 40 years, she was making decisions about her own money, her own house, her own life, without filtering those decisions through Walter's preferences. The numbers were small, the margin was thin, but the decisions were hers, and that mattered more than the math. Dorothy appeared the next morning with coffee. Helen found herself telling Dorothy everything. The marriage, the divorce, the birthday papers, the courtroom, the settlement, the key. She told it without self-pity and without performance, laying out the facts the way you lay out tools before beginning a job. Everything visible, everything accounted for. Dorothy listened with her whole body leaning forward slightly, coffee cooling in her hands. When Helen finished, Dorothy was quiet for a long time, the kind of quiet that is not absence but presence, the quiet of someone who is giving your words the weight they deserve. You're the bravest person I have met in a long time. But brave does not mean you have to do it alone. This neighborhood takes care of its own. My grandson Eddie is a handyman. Mrs. Caldwell down the street runs a community garden. The church has a job board, and I make a mean pot roast every Sunday. Why are you being so nice to me? You do not know me. Dorothy picked up her coffee. You chose peace over possessions. That tells me everything I need to know about who you are. Helen started making calls that afternoon. To the electric company, to the water department, to Eddie, who came by that evening and walked through the house with her, cataloging what needed fixing, with the cheerful pragmatism of someone who saw problems as projects. To Nathan, who answered on the first ring, because he always answered on the first ring now. Mom, where are you? Are you okay? I'm at the house on Maple Street, Danny, the one where you were born. A silence so complete she could hear the distance between them. I remember that house. I remember the backyard and the marks on the door. They are still here, every one of them. Then quietly, are you going to be okay, Mom? I am going to be okay, Danny. I am going to be more than okay. She hung up and stood in the kitchen, and she believed what she had told her son, or at least she was willing to act as though she believed it, which at 69, standing alone in a house that needed everything, was close enough to faith to function as the real thing. For the first time in decades, she felt exactly where she was supposed to be. 6 weeks after Helen Harrison walked out of a courthouse with a brass key and a suitcase, she had built something she had not expected to build: a routine. Mornings belonged to Eddie and the house. Afternoons belonged to Mrs. Caldwell and the garden. Evenings belonged to whoever showed up at her door, and someone always showed up because Maple Street was the kind of place where showing up was not an event, but a habit. Eddie arrived each morning with tools in the bed of his pickup truck, and a patience that seemed impossible for 25. He never rushed her. When Helen's hands could not grip the hammer properly because her knuckles had stiffened overnight, he adjusted the task rather than the expectation, finding work that required precision instead of force. He taught her to measure twice and cut once, to read a level, to feel the grain of wood before deciding where to drive a nail. Her palms developed blisters that hardened into calluses, ridges of thickened skin that she examined each evening with a satisfaction she could not have explained to anyone who had not earned their own. The porch was the first victory. 3 weeks of pulling rotted boards and measuring new ones, and one afternoon Helen stood on planks that held her weight without groaning, and looked out at Maple Street, and understood that she had fixed something with her own hands that had been broken for years. Mrs. Caldwell's garden became her second education. The community garden occupied a lot at the end of the block, a rectangle of earth that had been transformed through years of collective effort into something that produced beauty and sustenance in roughly equal measure. Raised beds of vegetables in tidy rows, herbs in mismatched containers, flowers planted among the food in a deliberate chaos that attracted pollinators and pleased the eye. A small greenhouse held seedlings. A tool shed painted cheerful yellow held implements that bore the wear of many hands, and at the center of it all, Mrs. Caldwell, 73 years old, with the energy of a woman half her age. The secret to staying alive is staying useful. The minute you convince yourself you are too old to matter, you start the slow business of dying. She handed Helen a pair of gloves and pointed her toward a row of beans that needed weeding. And Helen knelt in the dirt and began pulling things out of the earth that did not belong there. And the simplicity of the task filled something inside her that she had not realized was empty. The garden introduced her to people whose names she learned while her hands were busy, which is the best way to learn anyone's name in the context of shared work, rather than social performance. Ray was a veteran mid-50s who grew herbs with the meticulous attention of someone who had learned discipline in a place where discipline meant survival, and was now applying it to basil and rosemary, because the alternative applications were not things he wanted to revisit. He worked beside Helen in comfortable silence before he spoke. Courage usually looks like stupidity from the outside. From the inside, it is just doing what you have to do to keep breathing. Brenda was a young mother with twin boys who orbited her like small chaotic planets. Father Thomas maintained the roses with a devotion that suggested he considered them a form of prayer. They all talked while they worked, conversations that started nowhere and ended nowhere and covered everything in between. And those small exchanges filled their hours with something Helen had not experienced in the mansion neighborhood, where conversations were strategic and friendships were transactional. One Saturday morning, Mrs. Caldwell gathered the regulars and made an announcement. What if they converted the front section into an open community space, free vegetables for anyone who needed them? No questions. Take what you need. Give what you can. They spent 2 weeks transforming the front beds, and Helen found herself coming to the garden every day, not just to work, but to see who stopped by. One afternoon in late August, a woman about Helen's age approached the free section with the cautious body language of someone who was not sure she was allowed to want things. Is it really okay to just take some? That is exactly why it is here. Her name was Gail, widowed 6 months ago. Her husband had handled everything, and now she was learning at 67 how to exist inside a life she had never been taught to navigate alone. Helen recognized every word, not the specifics, but the architecture of the experience. You know what you need? A cooking buddy, someone to share meals with so that eating does not feel like a chore you are performing for an audience of one. I am at 47 Maple. Come by Monday evening. Gail came Monday and Wednesday and Friday. By the third week, the arrangement was no longer an arrangement but a fact. Other people began to join. Dorothy brought stories and dessert. Mrs. Caldwell brought vegetables and opinions. Ray appeared with a pot of chili so large it required 2 hands to carry, and so spiced it required a glass of milk to survive. Brenda came with her twins and a dish her mother had taught her. Helen's house filled with furniture from thrift stores and yard sales pieces that did not match each other, but matched the life she was building. She hung photographs on the walls, mostly Nathan at various ages. The house was decorated by necessity and instinct rather than design. and it looked nothing like the mansion where every object had been selected by a professional in a scheme that was impressive and coherent and completely devoid of personality. One evening after everyone had left and Helen was washing dishes, she looked around her kitchen, a counter still bearing flour from Gail's attempt at bread, which had been dense and slightly burnt, and received with applause usually reserved for miracles. The kitchen was objectively small and subjectively enormous, filled to capacity with the residue of people who had been there and would come back. It was Eddie who brought Frank Patterson into Helen's life on a Tuesday morning in September, when the air had begun to carry the first suggestion of autumn. "Miss Helen, this is my Uncle Frank. I mentioned you needed carpentry work on those kitchen cabinets." Frank was 68, gray hair cut short, warm brown eyes set in a face weathered by years of outdoor work, creased with lines that could have been from squinting into sun or from smiling frequently, and Helen suspected both. His hands were large and scarred in the specific ways that wood and tools mark the people who use them daily. "Frank Patterson, I believe you know my aunt from the garden." "Mrs. Caldwell is your aunt." "Extended family. This neighborhood runs on extended family and casseroles." He examined the kitchen cabinets with the focused attention of a doctor conducting an examination, running his hands along the wood opening and closing doors, crouching to inspect the joints. "These are original to the house. Solid oak. Good bones underneath all this paint. They just need love. I could teach you how to refinish them yourself if you are interested." "You would teach me?" "Why not? It is not difficult work. It just takes patience." They started the following week. Frank came over after his own work was done, arriving around 5 each evening, with sandpaper in various grits, chemical stripper brushes, stain samples, and the unhurried manner of someone who understood that the best way to teach a person something was to do it beside them. He showed Helen how to strip old paint, working the chemical into the layers and then scraping carefully, revealing the wood beneath the way an archaeologist reveals what has been buried. He taught her to sand with the grain, to feel with her fingertips when the surface was ready, to trust the wood to tell her what it needed. They worked 2 or 3 hours each evening, and then Helen would cook dinner and they would eat together while the stain dried and the kitchen smelled of oak and linseed oil. She learned that Frank had been widowed 8 years ago, that his wife had died after a long illness, that he had 3 grown children who worried about him constantly. He loved jazz and woodworking and terrible puns that made Helen groan and then laugh despite herself. Frank was easy to talk to, but what Helen valued most was something subtler. He did not treat her like a project. He approached her as a peer, a fellow adult, capable of learning new skills and making her own decisions, and his respect for her competence was more nourishing than any casserole. His children wanted him to sell his house and move closer to them, to stop taking on physical work, to slow down. Frank resisted with a stubbornness Helen recognized, because it lived inside her own chest, the refusal to be diminished by the concern of people who loved you. They were both fighting the same quiet war, the war against being rendered irrelevant by the affection of others. Then came the storm. In October, 3 months after Helen moved to Maple Street, a line of thunderstorms swept through the county with the particular violence of weather that has been building pressure for days and releases it all in a single furious exhalation. The rain was horizontal. The wind bent the trees into postures of submission, and the roof of number 47 began to fail. Helen woke at 2 in the morning to the sound of water hitting the hardwood floor of her bedroom. Not a drip, a stream, steady and insistent, pouring through a seam in the ceiling. She scrambled for pots, for buckets, for anything that would hold water, and she moved through the house, discovering new leaks in the living room. In Nathan's old bedroom, in the hallway where the growth chart marks were absorbing water that would warp the wood if she could not stop it. She covered the door frame with a trash bag and tape, working by flashlight, her hands shaking not from cold, but from the sudden terrible possibility that the thing she had built could be taken from her by something as indifferent as weather. Eddie came the next morning and climbed onto the roof and came down honest. "The whole roof does not need replacing, but a section of it does. Materials and labor, if you help, we are looking at 3 to 4,000. Helen opened her notebook. 80,000 had become 62,000 after the porch, the plumbing, the electrical panel. 3 to 4,000 more would bring her below 60. She sat at her kitchen table, and she felt for the first time since the courthouse the full weight of what she had done. Walter's voice arrived uninvited. When you run out of money, what then? Dorothy did not ask what was wrong, because Dorothy could read a room the way Helen could read a doorframe. Dorothy made coffee. She called Eddie. She called Ray, who had materials left over from a job. She called Mrs. Caldwell, who called Father Thomas. And by the end of the day, a plan had assembled itself around Helen's crisis without her having asked for it. The roof repair took a week. Helen worked alongside Eddie every day. Ray's salvaged materials brought the cost down to roughly 2,000, still significant, but manageable because the cost had been reduced not by luck, but by people who knew that the difference between a problem and a catastrophe was often just the number of hands available to address it. After the storm, Helen looked at her budget with clear eyes and made a decision she should have made sooner. She had been a teacher. She had credentials. She called the community college and asked about tutoring positions, and they needed someone to teach basic literacy to adults 3 mornings a week. The pay was modest but steady. She also began selling surplus vegetables from the garden at the Saturday farmers market, earning small amounts that added up over weeks into something that felt like stability. She was not rich. She was not comfortable in the way the mansion had been comfortable. But she was covering her expenses without touching her emergency fund, and the act of earning money through skills she had neglected for 4 decades felt like recovering a part of herself she had misplaced in the back of a closet and forgotten was there. But something harder than the roof was breaking. 2 weeks after the storm, Helen stood in the garden and learned that the ground beneath the community that had saved her was not as solid as she had believed. The lot where the garden grew belonged to a private landowner named Gerald Whitfield, who had allowed Mrs. Caldwell to use it through a handshake agreement nearly 15 years ago. Gerald had died in August. His son, a developer from Columbus who saw land the way Walter saw investments as numbers rather than narratives, had inherited the property and intended to sell it. Townhouses, 60 days to vacate. Mrs. Caldwell delivered the news beside the yellow tool shed with a piece of paper in her hand that trembled in a way her voice did not. Helen watched the information move through the group, the way a wave moves through water. Ray's jaw tightened. Gail pressed her hand over her mouth. Brenda pulled her twins closer. Father Thomas closed his eyes for a long moment, as though consulting someone not visible. Helen felt the ground shift in a way that had nothing to do with the earth. The garden was not just a garden. It was the place where she had become a person again. It was the center of everything she had built, and it was being taken away by a man who had inherited something he did not understand and intended to convert into profit. She responded the only way she knew how. She fought. She went home and spent 3 days researching municipal land use laws, calling the city planning office, writing letters to the town council, searching for legal precedents. She contacted a legal aid organization. She drafted a petition. She made spreadsheets and timelines and arguments, working 16 hours a day, eating. When she remembered sleeping, when her body forced the issue, driving herself with the relentless focus of someone who believed that sufficient effort would solve any problem. She forgot dinner with Gail on Monday. She missed garden hours on Tuesday. She did not return Dorothy's calls on Wednesday. On Thursday evening, Frank came to work on the one remaining cabinet door and found her sitting amid chaos. Her eyes read a cup of coffee gone cold beside food she had not touched. He did not tell her to rest. He sat down across from her and spoke with the directness of a man who had decided that kindness and honesty were the same thing. Helen, you are doing it again. Doing what? The thing that broke you at the mansion. Carrying everything alone and calling it strength. You are trying to save this garden the same way you tried to save your marriage by yourself, without asking anyone, burning through everything you have, because you believe that if you just work hard enough, you can hold the world together with your bare hands. You do not understand. If we lose the garden, these people lose everything. No, they lose the garden, not everything. You proved that yourself when you walked away from $3 million. Losing a place is not losing everything. But you are forgetting your own lesson. The words landed with the force of something thrown accurately, and Helen's first response was anger, bright and hot. The anger of a person who has been seen clearly at a moment when they prefer to remain hidden. She wanted to argue. She wanted to tell him this was different. But the anger could not sustain itself because beneath it was something older and more honest. Something Frank's words had exposed the way his sandpaper exposed the grain beneath old paint. She was afraid, not of losing the garden, although that was real. She was afraid that if the garden disappeared, the community would dissolve and she would be alone again, and the loneliness would be the same loneliness she had felt in the mansion. She had rebuilt her life around these people, and the possibility of losing them had activated the same desperate response she had relied on throughout her marriage: take control. Do everything, need no one, and above all, never admit that you are scared. I am terrified, Frank. The words came out raw, spoken for the first time. I am terrified that if the garden goes, everyone goes. And then I am back where I started, alone in a house, wondering what I did wrong. Frank reached across the table and put his hand over hers. His palm was rough with years of work, warm and steady. You are not alone because of the garden, Helen. You have a garden because you are not alone. The order matters. She sat with that for a long time, feeling the truth of it. Settle into her the way stain settles into wood, slowly following the grain, becoming part of the structure. Then she picked up her phone and called Dorothy. And through Dorothy, she called everyone. And she said the thing she had never said in 42 years of marriage. The thing Walter had made impossible by needing her to be the capable one who never cracked. I cannot do this alone. I tried and I failed. I need your help and not just your hands. I need your ideas. The community meeting happened on a Sunday afternoon in Helen's backyard. 15 people in lawn chairs and on overturned buckets and on the grass. Helen stood before them and admitted what she had learned at a cost she was still calculating, that asking for help was not a confession of weakness, but an act of trust. And that trust was the only material strong enough to build anything that lasted. They could not save the old garden. The developer had already purchased the land. But Father Thomas, who had been quiet throughout the meeting, raised his hand. The church has a parcel behind the parish hall. It has been unused for years. It is smaller than the current garden. It is not ideal, but I believe I can convince the vestry to grant a long-term lease. The new garden was half the size of the old one. Building it would take months. The free vegetable stand would go dark during the transition. It was not a rescue. It was a loss mitigated by resourcefulness, a defeat softened by the willingness to begin again, at a smaller scale with more realistic expectations, and the knowledge earned rather than assumed that beginning again was something this particular group of people knew how to do. Helen worked alongside everyone through the first weeks of clearing and preparing the new site, and she worked differently than before. She delegated. She asked for opinions. She deferred to expertise she did not possess. She let Ray design the layout because he understood drainage. She let Mrs. Caldwell choose the planting schedule because she understood seasons. She let Eddie build the beds because he understood structure. And she let herself not know things, which was harder than any physical labor, because not knowing required a vulnerability that Helen had spent a lifetime armoring herself against. After the crisis, Helen's relationship with Frank changed. Not with any single moment she could point to. The shift was tectonic, deep and slow, the kind of movement that rearranges landscapes over time, but that in the compressed time frame of two people in their late 60s, who understood that time was not unlimited, happened across the span of a few autumn weeks. They had seen each other at their least composed. Frank had watched Helen come apart, had seen her stubborn and exhausted and frightened and wrong. Helen had watched Frank choose honesty over comfort, and she had been furious with him, and then grateful, and then something she did not yet have a name for. But that felt like the warmth she had first noticed on the porch returned now with greater intensity and no intention of leaving. Dorothy noticed before either of them did. He looks at you like you are the answer to a question he has been asking for 8 years. We are friends, Dorothy. Friends do not refinish cabinets for 6 weeks when the job should take 3. The last cabinet door was finished on a Thursday in late October. Frank held it up to the light and turned it slowly, examining the grain he had taught Helen to reveal the oak glowing warm amber. He hung it on its hinges, and they both looked at the kitchen at cabinets that had been hidden under decades of paint and were now visible, beautiful, original. I am going to miss having an excuse to come over. You do not need an excuse. You are always welcome here. He met her eyes with the steadiness of a man who had decided something. Helen, I am going to be direct because we are both too old for the slow approach. I would like to take you to dinner, not as your carpentry instructor, as two people who enjoy each other's company and would like to find out what that becomes when you put a tablecloth and a candle between them. I would like that. They went to a small Italian restaurant in the next town, a place with red check tablecloths and candles in wine bottles. At one point, Frank reached across the table and took Helen's hand, and she let him, feeling the roughness of his palm against hers, the calluses on his fingers that matched her own. I'm not trying to replace anyone or fix anything. I just think you are remarkable, and I would like to keep discovering why. I would like that too. Driving home, Helen realized she had not thought about Walter once during the entire dinner. She had spent an evening as herself, not as Walter's ex-wife, not as a character in the story of her own loss, but as Helen, a person with opinions about movies and a preference for red wine and hands that could sand wood and a heart that was apparently still capable of opening. The call came the following Tuesday morning, the first Tuesday of November. The kind of bright, cold day that makes everything look sharper than usual. Mom, I am coming home. Nathan's voice carried something she had not heard in months. Excitement, pure, uncomplicated. The London office is transferring me back. We will be stateside in 3 weeks. Helen stood in the new garden, surrounded by beds that were still mostly bare earth and potential. And she wept. Not quiet, controlled weeping. Real weeping, the kind that bends you at the waist, that empties you out so thoroughly that what remains afterward is cleaner than what came before. Mrs. Caldwell came and put her arms around Helen without asking why. Happy tears. The happiest tears I have ever cried. My son is coming home. The 3 weeks before Nathan's arrival moved with the strange elasticity of time that matters. Helen painted Nathan's old room, a warm golden color she chose herself. She set up the third bedroom for Emma and Jack, buying twin beds at a thrift store and cheerful bedding on clearance. She made space in closets, stocked the bathroom with extra towels, filled the kitchen with cereal boxes she guessed her grandchildren might like, based on what Nathan had eaten as a boy, which was probably wrong. Because 30 years had passed, but the impulse behind the purchase had not changed. She also worried. The house was small, one bathroom, a kitchen that could barely accommodate 4 adults. No game room, no pool, no guest suite. She could not silence the voice that asked whether her house would be enough. The call came 2 days before his flight. Mom, Dad called. He wants us to stay at the mansion instead of with you. He said your place does not have room. Helen's stomach clenched. What did you tell him? I told him I would think about it. A pause. Mom, is your house really okay for all of us? It is not the mansion, Danny. It is small, 1 bathroom, but you are welcome here. You will always be welcome here. I will let you know. The waiting was its own torture. Helen tried to prepare herself for the possibility that comfort would win over connection. She would not blame Nathan if he chose Walter's house. She would understand. But she did not tell Dorothy or Gail or Frank about the call, because this was not a problem other people's hands could fix. The answer had to come from Nathan without interference. The day arrived. Helen cleaned until the house gleamed. She cooked all-day recipes from the same kitchen when Nathan was small enough to stand on a stool beside her and help by stirring things that did not need stirring. By 5 o'clock, the kitchen smelled of roasted chicken and baked bread. She stood on the porch in her apron flour on her hands and watched a rental sedan pull up to the curb. Nathan got out first, then Claire stretching carefully. Then the children tumbling from the back seat with the boneless energy of kids released from confinement. Emma at 7 already carrying herself with a self-possession that reminded Helen of Nathan at the same age, Jack at 5, more interested in the yard than the adults. Nathan looked at the house. He looked at the porch she had rebuilt. He looked at the woman standing in the doorway with flour on her apron and an expression trying hard to be calm and failing beautifully. And then he smiled. Not a polite smile. A real one, unguarded, the kind that begins in recognition rather than performance. He ran up the steps and hugged her with a force that lifted her feet off the porch boards, and she could feel in the strength of his arms everything he could not say on the phone. "You came here." Her voice muffled against his shoulder. "Of course I came here, Mom. Dad's house is just a building. This is where I started. This is home." That evening, the kitchen was chaos. Emma and Jack coloring on the floor with crayons Dorothy had brought along with a cake that was slightly lopsided, but frosted with authority. Frank arrived with wine, and the quiet competence of a man who understood his role was to be useful without being central. The kitchen was loud and cramped and warm and perfect in the way that only crowded rooms can be perfect. Later, after the children were in bed, Nathan and Helen sat on the porch in the darkness. The street was quiet. A dog barked far enough away that the sound was more texture than interruption. Dad called while we were at the airport. He was angry that I chose here. "I'm sorry he put you in that position." "Do not be. It was my choice." A pause. Then Nathan's voice shifted, carrying a weight Helen had not expected. "Mom, I need to tell you something. When you signed those papers in court, I was angry at you too, not just Dad. You, because you did not call me first. You did not ask me what I thought. You just gave up $3 million to protect me from a fight I did not ask to be protected from. And I spent months feeling like you had made a decision about my life without including me in it." Helen's breath caught. She had not known this. In all their calls, all their carefully managed conversations, Nathan had never said this. "When did that change?" "When I stood in your kitchen tonight and watched you cook dinner, surrounded by people who love you in a house you rebuilt with your own hands. I realized you were not protecting me from the fight. You were protecting yourself from becoming someone who fights. And that is a different thing entirely, and I am proud of you for knowing the difference." Helen could not speak for a moment. From inside the house, Claire's voice reading to the children muffled, and musical words Helen could not make out, but whose cadence she recognized because she had read to Nathan in that same voice, in that same house 30 years ago. "You being here means everything to me, Danny. Wherever you are is home, Mom. I finally understand that. It is not much." Helen gestured at the small house, the ordinary street. "It is everything, Mom. It is everything." 6 months passed. The new garden behind the parish hall had taken root. The beds Ray designed were producing their first real harvest, smaller than the old garden, but sufficient. The free vegetable stand had reopened with a new sign Helen had lettered. "Take what you need. Give what you can." The words had not changed, but the people reading them had. Helen's backyard had transformed. Frank had helped her build new raised beds from reclaimed wood. String lights hung between the trees, creating a canopy of warm light. A fire pit made from salvaged bricks sat at the center, surrounded by chairs collected from so many garage sales that the variety had become its own aesthetic. The first official neighborhood potluck was today. Although calling it the first was generous given that people had been showing up with food for the better part of a year. People kept arriving. Ray with his chili, Gail with bread that had evolved from dense and charred to golden and fragrant over months of practice, a transformation she sometimes compared to her own. Mrs. Caldwell's tomato sauce in mason jars, Nathan and Claire setting up tables while Emma and Jack chased fireflies, Frank at the grill teaching Jack to flip burgers safely, Dorothy directing operations. As the sun set, someone picked up a guitar. Helen moved through the crowd, and at one point she stopped beside Ray, who was standing at the edge of the yard with a plate of food watching Jack try to catch a firefly in a mason jar. "You know what that kid reminds me of?" Ray's voice was quiet, meant only for Helen. "Me, before everything, just running after something bright without worrying whether he would catch it." Helen watched her grandson lunging after the light, failing, laughing, lunging again. She thought about Nathan at 5 in the backyard of this same property, lurching toward a yellow ball. The continuity of it, the persistence of joy across generations, made her chest ache in a way that was entirely good. She stepped back and watched from the fence. Her small house visible through the kitchen window. Her modest yard. Her simple gathering. It bore no resemblance to the catered events she had hosted at the mansion, where the food was prepared by professionals and the conversations were calibrated to impress. Those parties had been beautiful. This was alive. "You look happy, Mom." Nathan appeared beside her with Emma on his shoulders. "I am happy, completely and absolutely happy. You deserve it." "Actually, I think I should thank your father. If he had not blown up our life, I never would have found my way here. I spent 40 years being the woman Walter Harrison needed me to be. I forgot how to be just Helen. This past year, I finally remembered." That evening, after the crowd had thinned and the string light swayed gently in the breeze and the fire pit had burned down to embers, Walter Harrison sat in his mansion 23 miles away in the living room that a designer had arranged to suggest warmth without requiring the presence of people who might actually provide it. Stephanie had left that morning. Not dramatically. She had simply packed a bag and said she was going to stay with a friend for a while, and they both understood what a while meant when said in that particular tone. The house was quiet with the silence Walter had once called peace and now recognized as something else entirely. He sat in an armchair that had cost $4,000 and looked at the room and tried to remember the last time someone had sat in any of the other chairs and could not. The television was off. His phone was on the table. He picked it up and scrolled to Nathan's number and put it down again. He picked it up and scrolled to Helen's number and put it down again. He stood and walked through the house room by room, his footsteps echoing on the marble floors. And in each room he found the same thing: perfection, and no one to share it with. He ended up in the kitchen, standing at the counter, where he had left the divorce papers 11 months ago, and he thought about the Valentine's card he had written in 1985 in a different kitchen, in a house he had dismissed as beneath him. And he could not connect the man who had written those words to the man standing in this kitchen, and the inability to make that connection frightened him more than anything had frightened him in years. The next morning, Helen's phone rang. "Helen, I heard through Nathan that you are doing well." "I am, thank you." Silence. Then, "I made a mistake with Stephanie, with the divorce, with all of it. I miss what we had. I was thinking we could try again." Helen had rehearsed this moment. In every rehearsal she had been composed and final, but what she had not rehearsed was what Walter said next. "Helen, I found the growth chart." Her hand tightened on the phone. "Last week, I drove to the house. I do not know why. Maybe because Nathan chose you. I stood in his old room and I saw the marks. 6 months, 1 year, 18 months. His voice fractured along a seam she had not known existed. "You made those marks. You measured him. And I realized standing there that I do not remember being present for a single one. I was at work. I was always at work. I was building a career that bought us a mansion, and I missed my son growing up, and I did not even know I was missing it until I stood in that room and saw your handwriting on the wood." Helen closed her eyes. She had prepared for Walter's arrogance. She had prepared for his manipulation. She had not prepared for his grief. because she had not believed he was capable of it. And hearing it now raw and unscripted, arriving not from the Walter who filed divorce papers, but from some earlier version of him, the one who had written a Valentine's card in 1985, and meant every word, she felt something she did not expect. She felt compassion. Not the compassion that forgives, not the compassion that reconciles. The compassion of a person who has suffered enough to recognize suffering in another, even when that person was the source of her own. I hear you, Walter, and I believe you are in pain, but I am not the person who can heal that for you. I spent 40 years trying to heal things you were not ready to face. You have to face this yourself now. So there is no chance. Not with me. But Walter, you just told me you do not remember being present for Nathan's childhood. Nathan has 2 children now. Emma is 7, Jack is 5. They are growing the way children grow, which is to say quickly and without waiting for the adults around them to be ready. You can be present this time. You do not have to miss it again. Silence. Long enough that Helen thought the call had dropped. I do not know how. I did not know how to start over at 69. I did it anyway. That is all any of us can do. She hung up and stood in the kitchen with her eyes wet and the cabinets Frank had taught her to restore glowing amber in the morning light, and the photographs of her grandchildren on the refrigerator. She was shaking, but not the way she had shaken at the courthouse. This was the shaking that follows release the body's response to letting go of something it has been carrying for a very long time. She was sad, not for the marriage which had been over long before the papers. She was sad for Walter standing in an empty room looking at pencil marks he had not been present for, confronting at 71 the weight of every evening he had chosen the office over the doorframe. She was sad for the 27-year-old woman in the photographs and the 29-year-old man who had written, "Every day with you is a gift," and meant it to people who had not known what they would become. But the sadness did not contradict her happiness. It was part of it. Woven into the same fabric, inseparable, the way the grain of wood contains both the years of growth and the years of drought, both recorded in the same rings, both necessary to the strength of the whole. That evening, Frank came for dinner. Just the 2 of them. They moved around the small kitchen in the rhythm they had developed over months. A choreography so practiced it required no thought. Each of them knowing where the other would be, the kind of coordination that emerges not from planning, but from paying attention. I love you. Frank's voice arrived between the sound of his knife against the cutting board and the bubbling of sauce on the stove, as natural and unannounced as those sounds themselves. Helen stopped stirring. She turned to face him. He was standing with the knife in one hand and an onion half in the other, and his eyes were steady and serious and slightly afraid, in the way that people are afraid when they have decided to say something that cannot be unsaid. I'm 68 years old. I do not have time to wait for the right setting or some perfect moment that will probably never come. I love you. I love who you are and who you are becoming, and the way you hold a sanding block, and the way you argue with Dorothy, and the way you measure twice even when once would be enough. You do not have to say it back. I just needed you to know. I love you too. I did not think I would feel this way again. I had accepted that this particular door had closed, but it did not close. It just led to a different room. He kissed her there in the kitchen with onions on the cutting board and sauce threatening to boil over, and the evening light coming through the window she had washed on her second day in this house when she was sleeping on the floor, and could not have imagined that 11 months later she would be standing in this exact spot being kissed by a man whose hands knew wood the way hers were learning to, whose grief had made him gentle, the way hers had made her brave, whose presence in her life was not a rescue but a collaboration. I talked to Walter today, Helen said afterward while they were eating. Frank did not flinch. He did not ask for details. He asked the only question that mattered. Are you okay? I'm okay, and I am sad. And those 2 things can exist in the same person at the same time. I'm still learning that. Frank nodded slowly. Sad and okay. I know exactly what that feels like. After dinner, they sat on the porch. The night had arrived, fully stars visible above Maple Street, in a way they never were above the mansion's neighborhood, where the houses were so large and brightly lit that they created their own glow. Here the stars were visible because the houses were small enough, and the lights dim enough, and the people who lived here had no interest in outshining the sky. Frank took her hand. Rough against rough, the calluses they shared a physical record of the work they had done together. Nathan had shown her his phone at the potluck that afternoon, a text message from Walter. "Tell Emma and Jack their grandfather would like to visit if that is welcome. I would like to try to be there this time." Helen had not responded. It was not her story to write. But she had read the words and felt something that was not forgiveness and not anger, but something rarer. The willingness to believe that people could change even late, even after decades of choosing otherwise. Because if she had changed at 69, then perhaps Walter could change at 71. "No regrets?" Frank asked. Helen considered the question one final time. She thought about the courtroom, and the key and the sleeping bag on the floor, and Dorothy's casserole, and the growth chart marks absorbing rainwater during the storm, and the garden they lost, and the garden they rebuilt, and Nathan running up the porch steps, and Frank's hand on hers across a red check tablecloth, and Walter's voice breaking over pencil marks he had not been present for. She searched herself for regret, the way you search a room you are leaving for the last time, checking every corner, every drawer, every shelf. Not a single one. She sat in the darkness, surrounded by the sounds of her neighborhood settling into sleep. The particular music of a place where people lived close enough to hear each other's evenings. Ending screen doors, closing televisions, going quiet, the last dog being called inside. She held Frank's hand, and she thought about what she had let go of, and what she had found, and the strange mathematics of loss that sometimes, if you are honest enough and brave enough, and willing to sit with the terror of having nothing, produces an answer greater than what you started with. She had given up marble floors and a prestigious address and designer furniture, and catered parties and the appearance of a successful life. She had let go of all of it, and in return she had found a small house that creaked when the wind blew and leaked when the rain was serious, and was by any objective standard not impressive at all. But inside that house were cabinets she had restored with her own hands, and a table surrounded by chairs from 4 different decades, and a door frame bearing the pencil marks of her son's childhood, and a kitchen that smelled of meals shared with people who came not because they were invited, but because they belonged. And around that house was a garden that fed strangers, and a porch where neighbors sat without needing a reason, and a street where people brought casseroles when you moved in, and materials when your roof failed, and honesty when you were too stubborn to see that you were repeating the patterns you had promised yourself you would break. She had Nathan, who had chosen her connection over comfort, home over house. She had grandchildren who chased fireflies in her yard. She had Frank, who loved her not for what she possessed, but for what she had proven she could build. She had Dorothy and Gail and Ray and Mrs. Caldwell and Eddie and Father Thomas and Brenda, a community assembled not by geography alone, but by the deliberate choice to show up for each other day after day in the small ways that actually constitute a life. She had skills she had taught herself, and confidence she had earned, and peace she had purchased at the price of everything she once thought she needed. And she had something else. She had the knowledge that Walter was sitting in his mansion reading a text message about his grandchildren, and considering perhaps for the first time in his life the possibility that showing up might matter more than succeeding. She did not know if he would follow through. She did not need to know. It was enough to believe that the door was open, that the same truth that had saved her might in its own time and its own way reach him too. I did not know how. I did it anyway. That was all any of them could do. The stars turned slowly above Maple Street. Frank's breathing had deepened beside her, the half-sleep of a man comfortable enough to let his guard down. Helen sat awake a while longer, holding his hand, listening to the neighborhood, feeling the weight of a life she had built from nothing. A life that weighed against all logic more than everything she had given up to build it. Sometimes the last stop is not an ending. Sometimes it is the place where you finally understand which direction you should have been traveling all along. Sometimes the mansion you think you want is the thing that keeps you from the life you are supposed to live. Sometimes letting go of everything is the only way to discover what was yours to hold. It is never too late to start over. It is never too late to build something worth having from the wreckage of something that looked valuable but was hollow at the center. It is never too late to learn that the calluses on your hands from work you chose are worth more than the smooth palms of a life someone else designed for you. The world will tell you otherwise. It will tell you to be realistic, to settle, to accept your age as a verdict rather than a starting point. You do not have to listen. You can choose the small house. You can choose the leaking roof and the difficult mornings and the beautiful, terrifying freedom of a life that is finally completely yours. Helen Harrison chose, and she had never been richer.